Who gave them the right to turn my peace into endless torture? That's what I screamed when 3 police cars stormed at me Lakeside Farm following an emergency complaint from Karen, the HOA president. They demanded I shut down my rental cabin, requested to inspect business permits, and threatened to seal off the entire area, all because of a small wooden cabin in the middle of peaceful woods. They targeted me with tactics I couldn't anticipate, and you'll be shocked when you learn what they did. But Karen made one critical mistake, a legal detail that both she and the police accidentally overlooked, a detail significant enough to turn her entire call into a serious case of overstepping. Comment where you're watching, because this is no longer an ordinary dispute. I'm Mason Reed, a software engineer who got fed up with city life. After inheriting my grandfather's 15-acre farm in rural Oregon, I decided to turn this place into my little paradise. The rustic wooden cabin that Grandpa left behind had been renovated by Minto, an ideal Airbnb rental, far from the city, but with all the amenities. Every morning I woke up looking out at the crystal-clear lake. I felt Grandpa was still beside me through every piece of wood he had touched. I thought I had found peace until I encountered Dolores Whitman, the woman who turned my dream into a nightmare. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October when everything started falling apart. I was preparing to welcome the Smith family, regular Airbnb guests who'd been coming to the cabin for 3 years straight, when I found an official-looking envelope wedged between my front door and the frame. The letterhead read Pinehurst Hills Homeowners Association in bold, intimidating letters that seemed designed to make recipients feel small. Inside was a single page of legal jargon that boiled down to one message: stop your illegal business operations immediately or face all necessary legal. The letter was signed by Dolores Whitman, HOA president, in handwriting so sharp it could cut glass. My first reaction was confusion mixed with a healthy dose of irritation. Pinehurst Hills was a gated community of McMansions about 2 miles down the winding country road from my property. I'd driven past it countless times, noting the perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes that screamed suburban conformity. But here's the thing that made no sense. My farm was in Riverside County, while Pinehurst Hill sat firmly within Pinehurst County boundaries. It was like the mayor of Portland trying to issue parking tickets in Seattle. The legal jurisdiction was completely different, and any halfway competent lawyer would know that HOA have exactly zero authority outside their designated communities. I decided to handle this the civilized way, despite every fiber of my being wanting to crumple up the letter and use it as kindling for my wood stove. I pulled up the HOA's contact information online and dialed the number, expecting to clear up what was a misunderstanding with a polite phone conversation. The woman who answered had a voice like ice cubes clinking in an expensive glass. Pinehurst Hills HOA, Dolores speaking. How may I assist you today? The formal tone immediately put me on edge, but I pressed forward with diplomacy. Hi, this is Mason Reed. I received a letter from your organization today about my property, and I think there might be some confusion. My farm is located outside a HOA's jurisdiction, so I'm not sure why. Before I could finish my sentence, Dolores cut me off with the precision OFA surgeon scalpel. Mr. Reed, there is no confusion whatsoever. Your commerce activists are directly impacting the property values and community standards of our residents. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to protect the interests of our homeowners, and that includes addressing external factors that threaten our community's integrity. The conversation went downhill faster than a boulder rolling off a cliff. It tried explaining the jurisdictional issue, pointing out that her HOA had no legal standing to regulate activities on my property. Dolores listened with the patience of someone counting seconds until they could destroy you. Mr. Reed, you clearly don't understand the broader implications of your actions. Your little business venture may seem harmless to you, but it's creating traffic, noise, and other disturbances that affect our entire area. I've been a practicing attorney for over 20 years, and I know exactly what legal options are available to address this situation. That's when I made my first crucial mistake. I got angry, not screaming angry, but the kind of cold attorney that makes you say things you probably shouldn't say to someone who's itching for a fight. Look, Miss Whitman, with all due respect, your HOA has about as much authority over my property as a hive over the International Space Station. My cabin rental is completely legal, properly permitted, and frankly, none of your business. If you have concerns about traffic or noise, you're welcome to contact the appropriate entity authorities who have jurisdiction here. The silence that followed was so thick you could have carved it with a saw. When Dolores finally spoke, her voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow sounded more threatening than shouting. Mr. Reed, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I will use every legal means at my disposal to address this situation, and I assure you, my resources and connections extend far beyond what you might expect. This conversation is being recorded for quality assurance purposes, and as August, you reconsider your position very carefully. Good day. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone like it had just grown fangs. Something about that final exchange sent ice water through my veins. It wasn't just the threat itself, but the confidence behind it. Dolores Whitman wasn't some suburban busybody with too much time on her hands. She was someone who genuinely believed she had the power to make my life miserable. Jurisdiction or no jurisdiction, I spent the rest of that afternoon doing what any reasonable person would do in my situation. I researched the hell out of Dolores Whitman and her precious HOA. What I found was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Online records showed that Pinehurst Hills HOA had been involved in numerous legal disputes over the past 3 years, always with Dolores at the center. Property owners, local businesses, and even a food truck operator had all found themselves on the receiving end of legal threats from the organization. Most had simply given up and moved away rather than fight. But here's what caught my attention. Over the past 6 months, 3 different LLCs with variations of Pinehurst development in their names had purchased large parcels of land around my farm. The properties formed a rough semicircle around my 15 acres, like fingers slowly closing into a fist. The timing was too convenient or coincidental, and the pattern was too strategic to be random. Someone was playing a much bigger game than simple HOA harassment. As the sun set over the lake that evening, I sat on my cabin's front porch with a buyer and tried to process what I'd stumbled into. My grandfather had always told me that this land would be my sanctuary, a place where I could build something meaningful and lasting. He'd fought his own battles to keep this farm in our family, working 3 jobs during the Depression to make mortgage payments and refusing offers from developers who wanted to turn their property into a shopping center. Now 60 years later, I was facing a different kind of threat from a different kind of predator. I pulled out my phone and played back the recording I'd made of my conversation with Dolores. Something about her final words nagged at me. My resources and connections extended far beyond what you might expect. That wasn't the language of someone making empty threats. That was the language of someone who had already mapped out their attack strategy and was confident in their ability to execute at that moment. I didn't understand the true meaning of her last statement. Resources that extend far beyond what you might expect. Wasn't bragging. It was a warning about a network of power that Dolores had been building for years, and I had just painted a target on my back. The attack started subtly, like a slow poison working its way through my bloodstream. 3 days after my phone call with Dolores, I woke up to an email from the Smith family canceling their weekend reservation. They'd been coming to my cabin religiously for 3 years, always booking months in advance, always leaving 5-star reviews. The email was polite but vague. Due to recent safety concerns in the area, we've decided to make other arrangements. Safety concerns. The most dangerous thing that had happened around here in the past year was old Mrs. Henderson's rooster getting loose and terrorizing the mailman. I called Jennifer Smith directly, and what she told me made my blood pressure spike into dangerous territory. Mason, we got this email yesterday from what looked like the county health department. It warned about potential environmental tours around your property and suggested that visitors avoid the area until further notice. I know it sounds crazy, but with the kids and everything, we just can't take any chances. Chef forwarded me the email and I stared at it in disbelief. The sender address was oregon.county.health@gmail.com, which any competent adult would recognize as obviously fake, but the formatting and language were professional enough to fool someone who wasn't looking too closely. That same afternoon, I discovered something that made my stomach drop to my boots. Someone had created a duplicate of my Airbnb listing with an identical property description and photos. But this version was populated with horrific fake reviews. Cabin smelled like sewage. Read one. Owner was drunk and belligerent. Claimed another. Found drug paraphernalia in the bathroom. Declared a third. The fake listing had been active for less than 24 hours, but it was already showing up in search results when people looked for rentals in my area. Whoever created it knew exactly how to game the system. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with Airbnb customer service, explaining the situation to increasingly confused representatives who kept transferring me to different departments. Meanwhile, I reviewed my security camera footage and found something that made my hands shake with rage. Every night for the past week, a black SUV with Pinehurst County plates had been parking at the end of my driveway around midnight, sitting there for exactly 30 minutes before driving away. The license plate was always obscured by mud or positioning, but threatening was too regular to be coincidental. Sleep became impossible that night. I sat in my grandfather's old recliner, the same chair where he'd spent his final months reading westerns and telling me stories about the early days on the farm. Mason, he'd said during one of our last conversations, sometimes you have to face a storm taller and how strong you are. But remember, boy, there's a difference between being strong and being stupid. Smart strength wins wars, not battles. His words echoed in my mind as I watched the black SUV return for its midnight surveillance. The next morning, I drove into town to visit Ezra Thompson at his general store. Ezra was one of those rare small-town fixtures who seemed to know everyone's business without being gossipy about it. His store had been serving the local community for over 20 years, and people trusted him with their probables the way they might trust an old family doctor. I found him restocking shelves with the methodical precision of a man who'd done the same task thousands of times. "Ezra, I need to ask you something." and I hope you'll be straight with me. Have you ever heard of Dolores Whitman causing problems for other local businesses?" Ezra stopped what he was doing and gave me a look that was equal parts knowing and concerned. "Son, you've stepped in something deep if Dolores has set her sights on you. That woman has more tricks up her sleeve than a Vegas magician, and she's not. I'm afraid to use every single one of them." What Ezra told me next completely reframed my understanding of what I was facing. Over the past 3 years, Dolores had systematically targeted to other local businesses using what he called legal exhaustion tactics. First was Mike's Auto Repair, a family-owned shop that had served the community for 30 years. Dolores filed noise, complaints, environmental violations, and zoning challenges until Mike spent more on legal fees than he made in revenue. He eventually sold to a corporation that immediately closed the shop and sold the land to developers. The second victim was Sarah Chen, who ran a small organic farm with a roadside stand. Dolores orchestrated a campaign claiming Sarah's customers were creating traffic hazards and that her organic certification was fraudulent. By the time Sarah proved all the accusations false, she'd lost most of her customer base and accumulated crushing legal debt. She now works as a cashier at the grocery store in the next town over, and her beautiful farm sits empty with a for sale sign that's been there for 18 months. "But here's what got me attention," Ezra continued, lowering his voice like he was sharing state secrets. "Both those properties, along with about 6 others around here, are now owned by companies connected to something called the Lakefront Paradiso Resort Project. Word is someone's planning to build a luxury resort that'll cover about 200 acres of prime lakefront property. Your cabin sits right in the middle of the planned access road." The pieces clicked together in my mind like tumblers in a lock. This wasn't about HOA standards or community values. This was about money. Big money. And my little cabin represented the final obstacle to a multi-million-dollar development project. Dolores wasn't some overzealous neighborhood watchdog. She was the point person for a calculated land grab that had been years in the making. I left Ezra's store with a business card for Camden Torres, a young lawyer who specialized in property rights and local government disputes. "He's good," Ezra assured me, "and he's not afraid to fight dirty when the situation calls for it." I called Camden from my truck and we scheduled a meeting for the next morning. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I might have allies who understood what I was really up against. That evening, I installed a more sophisticated security camera system and set up automatic recordings for all incoming phone calls. If Dolores wanted to play psychological warfare, I was going to document every move she made. I also made a decision that would prove crucial later. I started backing up all my evidence to multiple cloud storage accounts because something told to me that things were about to get much worse before they got better. I felt more confident with Camden scheduled to help and Ezra watching my back. But then the next morning arrived with a phone call that froze my blood solid. Dolores had just escalated this conflict to a complete line level, and I was about to discover that her resources and connections were even more extensive than I'd feared. Their phone call started at exactly 8:17 a.m. on a Thursday. Like Dolores had synchronized her watches with every government office in Oregon. First was the Riverside County Planning Department, informing me that they'd received a formal complaint about unauthorized commercial activities on my property and would need to inspect within 72 hours before I could fully process that information. My phone rang again. This time it was the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, explaining that they'd been notified of potential groundwater contamination from my septic system and would need immediate access for soil testing. The third call came from the IRS, not a local office but actual Internal Revenue Service, questioning whether I'd properly reported all income from my Airbnb rentals and suggesting I might want to consult with a tax attorney. The fourth and final call was from the Oregon State Fire Marshal's office, citing concerns about fire safety violations in commercial lodging facilities and scheduling an emergency inspection for the following week for separate government agencies. 4 different alleged violations, all reported on the same morning by the same concerned citizen, Dolores Whitman. I sat in my kitchen staring at the stack of official notifications that had arrived by certified mail, feeling like I'd been hit by a freight train traveling at the speed of bureaucracy. Each letter was professionally formatted using official letterhead and proper legal language that made my head spin, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Dolores hadn't just filed random complaints. She'd orchestrated a assault designed to overwhelm me with legal and financial pressure from multiple directions. The immediate consequences were devastating. My Airbnb account was suspended pending resolution of the regulatory investigations, which meant zero income for the foreseeable future. The booking cancellations started pouring in as word spread through online travel forums about the ongoing legal issues surrounding my property. By noon, I'd lost 6 confirmed reservations, representing nearly $3,000 in revenue I desperately needed to cover my mortgage and legal expenses. That night was the darkest I'd experienced since my grandfather's death. I sat in the cabin at 2 a.m. holding the final check in my bank account and wondering if I had the strength to continue this fight. The weight of 4 separate investigations felt like trying to hold up a collapsing building with my bare hands. I could hear my grandfather's voice in my memory. Mason, sometimes a man has to stand up to bullies even when the odds look impossible. But remember, son, you didn't have to stand alone. The next morning I called Camden Torres and explained the situation. His response was immediate and reassuring. Mason, what you're describing isn't coincidental compliance action. This is a coordinated harassment campaign using government resources, and it's illegal. Dolores has made a serious mistake by involving multiple agencies with inconsistent allegations. We can use Cephas against her. Camden's legal analysis was brilliant in its simplicity. When Dolores filed her complaints, she'd given slightly different versions of the same story to each agency. To the planning department, she claimed my cabin was operating as an unlicensed hotel. To environmental quality, she suggested I was running a commercial waste facility. To the IRS, she reported suspected large-scale tax evasion. To the fire marshal, she described my property as a hazardous commercial lodging operation. The contradictions in her statements were enough to prove she was filing false reports to multiple government agencies, which violated Oregon Revised Statutes 162.065 while Camden worked on the legal strategy. I reached out to Sage Mitchell, an investigative journalist at the Oregon Tribune, whom Camden had recommended. Sage had a reputation for exposing government corruption and corporate malfeasance, and her interest was immediately piqued when I described Dolores's systematic campaign against local businesses. I've been looking for a story like this for months, she told me during our first phone conversation. HOA overreach is becoming a serious problem in Oregon, and what you're describing sounds like it goes way beyond typical neighborhood disputes. What Sage told me next made my blood run cold. Her father had lost the family farm in eastern Oregon 15 years ago due to similar tactics employed by a different HOA working with developers. The experience had destroyed her family financially and emotionally, ultimately contributing to her parents' divorce and her father's early death from stress-related heart problems. This isn't just about your cabin, Mason, she said with quiet intensity. This is about holding powerful people accountable when they abuse the system to crush ordinary families. Sage's investigation uncovered disturbing connections between Dolores and key figures in local government. Records showed that Dolores had maintained consulting relationships with County Commissioner Thompson, Planning Department Supervisor Janet Walsh, and Deputy Attorney Martin Cross from the Oregon State Attorney General's office. These weren't necessarily illegal relationships, but the financial connections raised serious questions about conflicts of interest and potential corruption. The breakthrough came when Camden found evidence that Dolores had contacted each government agency separately, providing different contact information and using slight variations of her name to avoid triggering cross-reference checks. To the planning department, she was D. Whitman, concerned citizen to environmental quality. She was Dolores W. community representative. To the IRS, she identified herself as D. W. Whitman, HOA president. To the fire marshal, she was simply Dolores, resident. This pattern of deception was exactly what we needed to prove coordinated fraud. While we were building our legal case, I continued documenting every interaction with government officials and recording all phone calls from Dolores and her associates. My security cameras captured several more midnight visits from the black SUV, and I noticed that each visit coincided with a new complaint being filed against my property. The surveillance pattern was so regular that I could almost predict when the next government letter would arrive in my mailbox. Camden prepared a comprehensive response to all 4 agencies, pointing out the contradictions in Dolores's complaints and requesting investigations into her filing practices. We also prepared a formal complaint against Dolores herself, alleging the abuse of government resources and filing false reports. But even as we built our defensive strategy, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still playing catch-up in a game where Dolores held most of the cards. Just as we thought we'd found a way to fight back against bureaucratic onslaught, the biggest escalation yet was about to unfold. 3 police cars would soon be parked in my driveway with sirens wailing, and I would finally understand the true scope of Dolores's resources and connections. The coordinated legal assault had been just the opening move in a much larger and more dangerous. The sirens cut through the morning silence like chainsaws through silk, announcing the arrival of 3 police vehicles that turned my peaceful lakeside property into what looked like a crime scene from a cop show. 2 cruisers bore the distinctive blue and gold markings of the Pinehurst County Sheriff's Department, while the third displayed the green and silver colors of Riverside County. The timing was theatrical in its precision. Exactly 9:30 a.m. on a Friday, when any legitimate business owner would be starting their workday, Sergeant Brooks emerged from the lead Pinehurst County vehicle with the swagger of someone who believed he was about to make the most important arrest of his career. He was followed by Deputy Martinez from Riverside County, who looked confused about why he'd been called to a location that wasn't technically in his jurisdiction. The third officer, Detective Wilson from Pinehurst County, carried a clipboard thick with what appeared to be official documents and wore the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Before I could process what was happening, a black Mercedes pulled into my driveway behind the police cars. Out stepped Dolores Whitman dressed in a crisp business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, followed by a tall man in an expensive gray suit whom she introduced as my legal counsel, Marcus Wheeler. Behind them came a woman with a professional camera and press credentials hanging around her neck like a necklace of authority. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly to this emergency," Dolores announced in a voice loud enough to carry across Thelic. "As I explained in my reports, we have a serious public safety issue here that requires immediate intervention." She gestured toward my cabin like she was pointing out a toxic waste dump. "This illegal commercial operation has been operating in violation of county regulations for months, and the property owner has been completely uncooperative. Legitimate government oversight." Sergeant Brooks stepped forward with an officiousness that would have been impressive if it weren't so misplaced. "Mr. Reed, we've received reports of illegal business operations, possibly intent violations and resistance to lawful government inspections. We need you to cease all commercy activists immediately and allow our officers to secure the scene for investigation." He handed me a document. It looked official enough to fool most people, complete with multiple agency letters and enough legal jargon to choke a horse. The situation became increasingly surreal as Deputy Martinez pulled Sergeant Brooks aside for a whispered conversation that grew progressively more animated. I couldn't hear the exact words, but their body language suggested a growing disagreement about who had the authority to do what. Meanwhile, Detective Wilson was walking around my property, taking notes and photographs, like he was documenting evidence at a murder scene. That's when the Smiths' rental car pulled into my driveway, returning early from their hiking trip to find what appeared to be a police raid in progress. Jennifer Smith jumped out of the car and immediately called 911 on her cell phone. Reporting what she believed was a home invasion at the property where she was staying. Within minutes, a third police vehicle arrived, this one from the Oregon State Police, responding to the Smiths' emergency call about armed intruders at a vacation rental. The chaos that followed was like watching a Three Stooges routine performed by people with guns and badges. 3 different law enforcement agencies were now on my property, each with different information about why they were there, and none of them completely certain about their jurisdiction or authority. Dolores stood in the middle of the confusion, like a conductor trying to direct an orchestra where every musician was playing a different song. "This is exactly the kind of dangerous situation I was trying to prevent," Dolores announced a thick rowing crowd, positioning herself perfectly for the photographer who was documenting everything. "When illegal businesses operate without proper oversight, it creates public safety hazards that put innocent families at risk." She gestured toward the Smiths, who were huddled near their car, looking like they'd accidentally wandered into a war zone. The cavalry arrived in the form of Camden Torres, who must have broken several speed limits getting to my property after I sent him a panicked text message. He emerged from his Honda Civic carrying a briefcase and wearing the determined expression of a lawyer who'd found his calling. "Excuse me, officers, but before this situation escalates further, I think there are some serious jurisdictional questions that need to be addressed." Camden's presence immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation. He approached the officers with the confidence of someone who actually understood the law, carrying official documents that weren't just impressive looking, but actually meant something. "Sergeant Brooks, according to the county maps and property records I have here, this entire property lies within Riverside County boundaries. Pinehurst County Sheriff's Department has no jurisdiction or conduct enforcement actions here." What happened next was beautiful in its simplicity. Camden spread a large county surveyor's map across the hood of his car, pointing out the clearly marked boundary lines that put my property firmly outside Pinehurst County's jurisdiction. The embarrassment on Sergeant Brooks's face was visible from space as he realized he'd potentially overstepped his authority in a very public way. Dolores's reaction was the most telling part of the entire spectacle. Instead of looking surprised or apologetic about the jurisdiction, she appeared frustrated that her carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart. "I coordinated with both departments to ensure adequate response to this situation," she said, apparently not realizing that she just admitted to manipulating law enforcement agencies. "This is a matter of public safety that transcends artificial boundary lines." Sage Mitchell had been recording the entire confrontation from her position near the tree and capturing every word off Dolores's admission that she had coordinated the response from multiple agencies. That single statement would prove to be the smoking gun we needed to demonstrate that Dolores had deliberately created this jurisdictional case as part of her harassment campaign. As the police officers sorted out their jurisdictional confusion and began the embarrassing process of explaining to their supervisors why they'd responded to a call outside their authority, Dolores retreated to her Mercedes with Marcus Wheeler. But before leaving, she rolled down her window and fixed me with a stare that could have frozen lava. "This isn't over, Mr. Reed, not even close." When the dust settled and the last police car disappeared down my driveway, I looked into Dolores' eyes one final time and saw something that chilled me to my core. She was still smiling. like everything that had just happened was exactly according to Toplin, as if this entire chaotic confrontation had been just the opening act for something far more sinister than he could imagine. The media blitz started before I'd even finished my morning coffee. By 7:00 a.m. Saturday, the Pinellas County Herald had published a front-page article with the headline, "Local Farm Owner Defies Law Enforcement Threatens Community Safety." The accompanying photo showed me gesturing animatedly while surrounded by police officers, taken from an angle that made me look like I was either having a psychotic break or leading an armed rebellion against the government. The article was a masterpiece of selective journalism, painting me as an unhindered property owner who had violently resisted legitimate law enforcement actions and posed an ongoing threat to public safety. It quoted unnamed sources describing my erratic behavior and hostile attitude toward authority, while presenting Dolores as a concerned community leader trying to protect innocent families from a dangerous situation. The journalist conveniently forgot to mention the jurisdictionalist or Dolores' admission about coordinating the police response. Within hours, the story had spread across social media like wildfire in a drought-stricken forest. Facebook groups split into warring factions. Number Justice for Mason supporters shared articles about HOA overreach and property rights, while Number Protect Pinellas advocates posted dramatic warnings about dangerous illegal businesses threatening their children's safety. Twitter exploded with hot takes from people who knew nothing about this situation but had very strong opinions about it anyway. The psychological pressure was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications from social media platforms, news outlets, requesting interviews, and anonymous messages that ranged from supportive encouragement to graphic death threats. Someone had posted my personal phone number and email address online, leading to a deluge of calls and messages from strangers who felt compelled to share their thoughts about my character, my property, and what they thought should happen to people like me. That night was the darkest point of my entire life. I sat in my grandfather's cabin at 2 a.m. holding the shotgun he'd used for hunting deer, wondering if I had the strength to continue fighting a battle that seemed designed to destroy me piece by piece. The weight of the entire world seemed to be pressing down on me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I seriously considered just giving up and walking away from everything my grandfather had worked to build. The memory of my grandfather's voice cut through the despair like sunlight through storm. "Mason, sometimes you have to go through hell to prove you deserve heaven. But remember, boy, you don't have to walk through hell alone." I put the shotgun back in its cabinet and called Camden, even though it was the middle of the night. "I need help," I told him simply. "I can't do this by myself anymore." Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Braden Calloway knocked on my door at 8 a.m., introducing himself as a former partner at Sullivan & Associates, the prestigious Portland law firm where Dolores had worked before her mysterious departure. Braden was tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense eyes that suggested he'd seen things that kept him awake at night. "Mr. Reed, I've been following your situation in the news, and I believe I have information that could be crucial to your case," Braden said, accepting my offer of coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "Dolores Whitman destroyed my career and my family, and I've been waiting 3 years for the opportunity to return the favor." The raw pain in his voice was unmistakable, the sound of someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. What Braden told me over the next 2 hours completely reframed my understanding of who I was dealing with. Dolores hadn't just left Sullivan & Associates, she'd been fired for manipulating evidence in a major real estate case and subsequently been suspended from practicing law by the Oregon State Bar for 18 months. The suspension had ended 6 months ago, but she never resumed practicing law, instead focusing her energy on what Braden called her shadow career in property development and local politics. The real bombshell came when Braden showed me emails and financial records he'd saved from their time working together. Dolores had been using a business identity called DW, Legal Consultants, to purchase property around my area, despite not being legalized to practice law during her suspension period. More damaging still, the emails showed clear evidence. Thatch'd been paying consulting fees to county officials in exchange for advanced information about zoning changes and development opportunities. She called it strategic relationship building, Braden explained, his voice bitter with old resentment. But what she was doing was buying inside information and using her legal training to manipulate the system for personal gain. When the state bar investigation started, she threw me under the bus to Savi herself, claiming I was the one who'd initiated all the questionable practices. Braden's motivation for helping me became clear as he described the aftermath of the scandal. His wife had left him, taking their 2 children and moving across the country to escape the professional disgrace that had destroyed his reputation. He'd lost his law license, his savings, and his family, all because Dolores had needed a scapegoat to protect her interests. "I've spent 3 years rebuilding my life and waiting for the chance to expose what she is," he said. "Your case gives him that opportunity." The evidence Braden provided was devastating enough to destroy Dolores completely, but he warned me that cornering a desperate person could be extremely dangerous. When Dolores feels threatened, she doesn't just fight back. She tries to annihilate her opponents, he cautioned. She has no boundaries and no conscience when it comes to protecting herself. You need to be prepared for anything. Together with Camden and Sage, we began building what Camden called our nuclear option, a comprehensive legal and media strategy designed to expose every aspect of Dolores's corrupt practices over the past 3 years. We documented her illegal property purchases, her payments to government officials, her abuse of the legal system, and her systematic harassment of local business owners. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but even as we prepared our counterattack, Dolores was planning her escalation. Late that night, I received a phone call that made my blood freeze. Dolores's voice was different this time, shaky and desperate rather than coldly controlled. "Mr. Reed, you don't understand what you're doing. I've lost everything before, and I can't let that happen again. If I can't have peace in my life, then neither can you." I felt the tide turning in our favor for the first time since this war began. And for the first time, I heard real fear in Dolores' voice. But as my grandfather used to say, a wounded animal is always the most dangerous. And the weapon Dolores was about to deploy would make everything that had come before look like a polite disagreement between neat. Monday morning arrived with the kind of devastating efficiency that only expensive lawyers can deliver. I was barely awake when Camden called with news that made my coffee taste like battery acid. Morrison and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in Portland, had filed a federal lawsuit against me on behalf of Dolores. The suit was a legal nuclear weapon seeking $2 million in damages for defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and something called tortious interference with business relationships. The timing was surgical in its precision. While I was still processing the federal lawsuit, a courier delivered an emergency restraining order that prohibited me from operating my cabin until contacting any government officials about Dolores or discussing her on social media. Violating their restraining order would result in immediate arrest and contempt of court charges. Within hours, my bank called to inform me that they'd received a court order to freeze my checking account pending the outcome of the litigation. By noon, I was effectively bankrupt and legally muzzled, watching 3 years of hard work disappear into the void of federal court procedures. Dolores had played her final card, and it was a royal flush that seemed impossible to beat. The woman who'd been suspended from practicing law for corruption was now using the most powerful law firm in the state to destroy me through the very legal system she'd previously abused. That's when Camden Torres proved why expensive lawyers sometimes earned their fees. While I sat in my cabin feeling like I'd been hit by a meteor, Camden was orchestrating what he called Operation Truth Bomb, a coordinated counterattack that would expose every aspect of Dolores's criminal enterprise in one devastating blow. "Mason, we're not just going to defend against her lawsuit," he told me with the confidence of a general who'd already won the war. "We're going to destroy her so completely she'll spend the next decade in federal prison." The first salvo came from Camden himself, a 47-page motion to dismiss the federal lawsuit, accompanied by exhibits that documented every illegal action Dolores had taken over the past 3 years. The filing included financial records showing her bribery of County Commissioner Thompson, of her purchasing insider information from planning department officials, and recordings of her threatening other business owners. Most damaging of all, Camden had obtained copies of the Oregon State Bar disciplinary records, showing that Dolores had been suspended for manipulating evidence and client fraud. While Camden was filing legal documents that read like an organized crime indictment, Sage Mitchell was launching her assault. Through the Oregon Tribune, her investigative series titled The Pinehurst Files began publishing that same afternoon with revelations that sent shockwaves through local government. The first article exposed a network of corruption surrounding Dolores's property development scheme, complete with financial records showing illegal payments to government officials and forged documents used to manipulate zoning decisions. Braden Calloway provided the smoking gun evidence that would ultimately destroy Dolores completely. Hidden in his files from Sullivan and Associates were email chains that showed Dolores had been operating an elaborate money-laundering scheme through shell companies using fake legal consultations to hide payments from mysterious investors who wanted to remain anonymous. More importantly, the emails contained recordings of phone calls where Dolores had explicitly threatened other property owners with legal and personal consequences if they didn't sell their land. But the most devastating revelation came from the at least expected source. The man Dolores had introduced as her legal counsel, Marcus Wheeler, wasn't a practicing attorney at all. Camden's investigation revealed that Wheeler was a former legal assistant who'd been fired from his previous job for forging attorneys' signatures on court documents. When Dolores presented him as her lawyer during the police confrontation, she had committed the federal crime of fraud in addition to her state law violations. The legal avalanche that followed was beautiful in its completeness. The Oregon State Attorney General's office announced they were investigating Dolores for racketeering under state RICO statutes. The FBI opened a federal investigation into her, money laundering and bribery. County Commissioner Thompson resigned in disgrace and was indicted on corruption charges. Most satisfying of all, Morrison and associates withdrew from representing Dolores when they discovered their client had lied about the criminal history and provided them with falsified documents. The critical legal detail that fulfilled the promising. My original story became crystal clear through Camden's analysis. When Dolores called police from 2 different counties and identified herself as legal counsel while knowing she was still under suspension from the Oregon State Bar, she had committed multiple federal crimes simultaneously, filing false police reports across county lines constitute mail fraud under federal statute. Using her fake legal credentials to intimidate me and manipulate law enforcement constituted wire fraud. Most seriously, coordinating with multiple government agencies while misrepresenting her legal status violated the federal Hobbs Act regarding distortion affecting interstate commerce. The domino effect was swift and merciless. The federal court immediately Dolores's lawsuit and sanctioned Morrison and associates for filing frivolous litigation. My bank account was unfrozen and the restraining order was vacated. The Oregon State Bar announced they were reopening their investigation into Dolores's conduct and considering permanent disbarment. Local news outlets that had initiated me as a dangerous criminal began publishing corrections and apologies. Standing in my cabin Thate Vening, watching the sun set over the lake that had been in my family for 3 generations, I felt my grandfather's presence more strongly than ever. "We did it, Grandpa," I whispered to the empty room. "We provided the truth still matters, even when powerful people try to bury it." For the first time in months, I could breathe freely without feeling like the weight of the world was crushing my chest. But even as federal agents were preparing arrest warrants and prosecutors were building their cases, Dolores Whitman was planning one final act. After desperation, when someone has lost everything and faces decades in prison, they sometimes choose to take their enemies down with them, no matter the cost. The woman who tried to destroy me through legal manipulation was about totem, something far more dangerous and personal than anything she'd done before. The final confrontation came not with violence, but with the methodical precision of federal law enforcement doing what they do best. Tuesday at 6 a.m., I watched from my cabin window as a convoy of black SUVs surrounded Dolores Whitman's Pinehurst Hills mansion. Like something from a movie about organized crime takedowns, the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force had been building their case for weeks. And when it finally moved, it was with overwhelming force and undeniable evidence. Dolores's last desperate gambit had been pathetically pricked over the weekend. She'd attempted to liquidate her assets and flee the country, transferring money to forged accounts and booking flights to non-extradition countries. But her frantic phone calls and financial trance had been monitored by federal agents since the day Braden first contacted them with his evidence. Every move she made only added more charges to an indictment that already read like a masterclass white-collar crime. The woman who tried to destroy me through legal manipulation made one final mistake that sealed her fate completely. In her desperation to escape justice, she'd hired actual criminals to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence. The private investigators she'd contacted were undercover federal agents running a sting operation on corruption in local government. Her recorded conversations with them provided crystal clear evidence of witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. The arrest was almost anticlimactic after months of psychological warfare and legal maneuvering. Dolores emerged from her mansion in handcuffs, no longer the imperious HOA president who'd terrorized local business owners, but a frightened woman facing the rest of her life in federal prison. The charges read like a greatest hits album of financial crimes: racketeering under federal RICO statutes, money laundering through shell companies, wire fraud, mail fraud, bribery of public officials, filing false police reports, practicing law without a license, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. But the most shocking revelation came from the least expected source. Ezra Thompson, the quiet general store owner who'd seemed like nothing more than a helpful local businessman, revealed his true identity as I watched the news coverage of Dolores's arrest. He was Ezra Thompson, retired special agent from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who'd moved to our rural community 3 years earlier to care for his terminally ill. He'd been quietly documenting Dolores's criminal activities since her first suspicious real estate transactions, waiting for the right moment to activate a federal investigation. "I've been building a case against her since 2021. Ezra explained when he visited my cabin that afternoon, looking more like a federal agent than a store owner for the first time since I'd known him. Financial surveillance showed she was laundering money through 12 different shell companies and had illegally transferred over $2.3 million from fraudulent investor accounts. Your situation provided the perfect trigger event to bring down her entire criminal enterprise. The scope of Dolores's corruption was staggering, even by federal crime standards. Her network had extended throughout Oregon's local government system, with tentacles reaching into planning departments, county commissioners' offices, and even the state attorney general's office. She'd been operating what federal prosecutors called a systematic scheme to manipulate local government for personal financial gain that had affected dozens of property owners and cost taxpayers millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. The consequences were swift and comprehensive. Dolores was indicted on 14 federal charges that could result in over 40 years in prison. County Commissioner Thompson received a 4-year sentence for accepting bribes and resigned from office in disgrace. The entire Pinehurst Hills HOA board was dissolved and replaced with court-appointed administrators who immediately issued a public apology to me and the other business owners who had been targeted by Dolores's schemes. The positive aftermath exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. My cabin rental became famous as the David versus Goliath story that inspired people nationwide to stand up against institutional corruption. Booking requests poured in from guests who wanted to stay at the place where the little guy beat the system. Camden Torres was promoted to partner at his law firm and became the go-to attorney for property rights cases throughout Oregon. Sage Mitchell won the Oregon Press Association's Investigative Journalism Award for her Pinehurst Files series that exposed corruption throughout the state. Braden Calloway's vindication to launch Callaway Legal Aid, a non-profit organization providing free legal assistance to victims of HOA abuse and government corruption. Dolores destroyed my life, he told me during the ribbon-cutting ceremony for his new office. But helping people fight back against bullies like her has given my life more meaning than I ever thought possible. The personal transformation was even more profound than the professional victories. Standing in my grandfather's cabin 6 months after Dolores's arrest, I finally understood what he'd meant when he said that sometimes you have to go through hell to prove you deserve heaven. The fight hadn't just been about keeping my property. It had been about proving that ordinary people could still win against corrupt systems when they dared to stand up and fight back. I decided to expand the property into something my grandfather would have been proud of, the Reed Legal Sanctuary, a retreat center for people fighting their own battles against institutional abuse. The facility would provide free accommodation for families dealing with airquay harassment, legal consultation services with Camden's firm, and workshops on property rights and legal self-defense. The slogan we chose captured everything I'd learned from this experience. Where justice and peace meet. As I opened the door to welcome our first guest, an elderly couple being threatened by their HOA with foreclosure, I knew that my war with Dolores Whitman had been about much more than one piece of property. It had been about proving that, in a world where powerful people often seem untouchable, regular folks still can fight back and win. The key is having the courage to stand up, the wisdom to gather allies, and the persistence to see justice through to the end. My grandfather always said that land doesn't just belong to the person who holds the deed. It belongs to the person willing to fight for it. 3 generations later, that lesson still holds. Like and subscribe Alex Stories if you love that story.